War's horrible. It's evil. It's horrible. So don't do it unless you have a good reason, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, something worth killing for. We didn't have that. I knew that. Many of us knew that. And the people that sent us, they absolutely knew that. But they were protecting themselves, protecting their reputations, getting promotions. We were just, we were just, I don't know what we were to them.
I wanted to start actually by you responding to one of my reactions to what you wrote. Um, and it's something that it's related to a theme that I've noticed over the years. For example, in classes, if we're reading a memoir, a Civil War memoir, and the guy is writing about some battle and the body count is horrendous, and we're reading that. And then he writes about horses that also were shot, and the horses are also in their death throes. That the students would respond more to the suffering of the horses than to the suffering of the people. Um, and what brings that to mind is, and I'm just interested in your response to this, what you think about it. Of the stories you tell, the one that bothered me the most, and I have to say, and there's something perverse about it, but the one that bothered me the most is the rat story. The way you describe it, this poor thing trying to survive, then the guys dump it out of the barrel, throw gas on it. If I remember correctly, try to light it on fire. I don't remember that part. But then
They did light it on fire.
they light it on fire, and then they beat it to death with a shovel.
Yeah, only when it was headed toward another bunker. That's the reason they beat it to death with a shovel.
And I say it's perverse that that's the story that bothered me the most, partly because you tell a number of stories of really immense human suffering. Um, and then also, I know that the trouble that rats were, and I hear other vets say, I'm in a bunker and I saw a rat and I shot it, something like that, and that doesn't bother me. But what I guess, and I ask myself, why is this the story, the one that really bothers me? And it's because I think of how drug out the death of this creature was. I mean, it's trying to survive drowning all night long, and then it, comes to this inglorious end. What is your response when you hear somebody say, of all the hard stories you describe, and some folks would say, look, that's a rat, that's not even a hard story. But of all the hard stories you describe, this is the one that at least one reader, that's the story that bothered that one reader the most.
I think two things. I think when you initially start talking about the horses were innocents. Um, they're like children. When children suffer, it's not their fault. They're totally innocent. And the horses, they just were doing their job and they didn't choose to be there, didn't choose to do that. So I think that makes it harder for me. When children or animals suffer, that really bothers me. The rat, it hit me the same way that it hit you, but only because um, it reminded me of all the guys that did what that rat did.
Mm.
Um, that worked so hard to survive um, and suffered through so much and then didn't. And that bothered me. Um, I think I think those guys, I said in the book that, I think that, we were quick to kill anything we feared. And I think that fear builds in people. And when it builds in people, it creates anger and hatred. And I think that those guys hated rats, hated that rat. And they didn't just want to kill it, they wanted it to die hard. Now, kids do that sometimes and aren't afraid, because kids explore those things. But I think it's like kids that get bullied, sometimes they bully. Um, and I think that for those guys, I think if you're in the rear, one of the things that you were the most afraid of were rats. They carried rabies, they'd bite you, and they would face you down. I mean, they were big and dangerous, and they knew it. And I think those guys were getting revenge. That was their way of getting revenge. It's vicious, but people are vicious. And the more scared they get and the more angry they get, the more vicious they are. And that, unfortunately, is human nature. I think you have to fight that all the time, especially if you're in a combat zone.
This brings me to another difficult story you tell. And this story has to do with understanding how another soldier could have done something that was obviously terrible. Something that in any context outside of war, um, I think people would immediately condemn, rightly. Um, in the context of war, it's something that we may still condemn, but with caveats and with expressions of understanding. At least that's my sense of it. When you described it, I felt like obviously you don't want to condone this, but it's not hard to understand how it happened. And my sense is that that is your own perception as well. I'm interested in you talking about it. And I wonder if you could just share the story of the door gunner and when he relates what he did to you, and then when you've related that story, maybe we could talk about it a little bit.
It was I was on my way back to my unit, um, and I just stopped. You could just take chopper rides anywhere. A guy like me could, because I'd been there and I had the look of a guy that had been there. So if you wanted to go somewhere, you just went to a chopper pad and say, "Hey, are you headed here? You have room?" And the guy said, "Yeah." You just get on and you'd go. On the way back, I stopped. I couldn't catch him the next hop, so I stopped and I just went in a bar as a club. And there was a guy sitting in the back corner, and I looked around. After you've been there for a while, you can tell the guys that've been there and done that, the guys that are grunts. You can just sense them. And there was only one guy like that, and he was sitting up against the back table, um, and but he looked like a guy that maybe wanted to be left alone. So I didn't go there. I just sat somewhere else. But he spotted me immediately, and he came over, you know, what country you work in, that kind of stuff. Wanted to know all the stuff you ask other grunts. Um, and we started talking, and then he told me this story. Um, he had been a grunt, been in the jungle, and then he caught a ride on a helicopter as a door gunner. And so I asked him how he liked that, and he just told me this story about he was on the chopper, and there were three he thought enemies, or he called them. The word "gook" is a terrible word, but in Vietnam, that's the word.
Absolutely.
Um, so anyway, he started telling me that he saw three gooks, and he started shooting. And he said two of them made it into the tree line, and the third one was too slow because she was pregnant, and he killed her. And I don't. He told me that, and he told me like in a laughing way, like, and I could see that he wanted me to say it was okay because it was bothering him. He acted like he didn't care, but he did care. And it was shocking to me because he was one of us and we didn't do those things. Um, I knew guys did. And I knew there were some people that didn't have any compunction at all about doing that. But almost all of us did not. But this wasn't a guy that didn't have any compunction about doing it. This is a guy I could tell that it was really bothering him. And anyway, he waited for me to say something. I didn't give him approval. I just said, "Hey, you're really screwing up. What are you going to do when you get home?" And his face just fell. I mean, it's not what he wanted to hear, but I think it's what he needed to hear. And that's it. I mean, he didn't stay very long because we didn't have much to talk about. But I was surprised at myself because I felt really horrible for that woman, that pregnant woman that died. And I felt just as horrible for him because I think they were both victims.
No, you don't know, you don't have a specific answer to this because you don't know this soldier's story. But you spent a lot of time in the jungle, and you know, in what you write, you spent a lot of time, you know, sort of describing the difficulties of the jungle. And I often think, you know, put the VC and the NBA aside, being in the jungle in South Vietnam is just so miserable. The ants, the leeches, the snakes, the mosquitoes, the heat, the rain, the humidity. It's just relentless. That in itself is so miserable. And then you put the NBA on top of that. But let's think about this young man for a second. And just the question is, what happens in the world of war so that a young man who, as you describe him, had some conscience, we're not talking about a sociopath here, we're talking about a person who you sensed, you know, uh, had some feelings of regret. You didn't use that word, but, you know, he's obviously thinking about what he did. What happens in the world of war so that a young man with a conscience goes into war and something happens to him so that now he's in a chopper on a 50 cal or whatever the weapon is, and he shoots at people. Presumably he can see that one of them is pregnant and still shoots and kills her. I very much doubt that 3 years before, if someone said, "Hey, would you like to jump in a helicopter with a machine gun and kill a pregnant woman?" I very much doubt he'd say, "Yeah, that's something I'd be interested in doing." I doubt that. Something happened to him in Vietnam. Given your experience, given what you saw, um, what happened so that a kid with a conscience at some moment in the war thought that this was a thing worth doing?
Well, I'm not. I'm not sure that. I'm not sure that he was consciously aware that he was trying to deal with his remorse. I think he was trying to frame it in a way where he wouldn't feel so much remorse.
Mm.
That, it's okay, it's a war. We just do those things. This another grunt. I met him, I respect him. He's going to see it my way. I didn't. Um, but I think that what happens, I think the jungle was a fearsome place. It really was. You hear a lot about heroes. I don't believe in heroes. What I do believe is that everybody that I knew that stepped in that jungle with me was courageous because it took a lot of nerve just to take one step after another in that jungle. And it wasn't just, like you said, the conditions were horrible. I mean, people covered with ringworm, mosquito bites, prickly heat rash, leech bites, um, not enough to eat, not enough to drink. Um, so hot, the heat just boiling out of you. Um, and working hard. A lot of guys had 80-pound or more packs that they carried, um, and scared all the time. If you weren't scared, there was something wrong with you because it's like walking in a closet, um, and you can get shot from. Well, I did get shot at from like 6 feet away. You know, it's just that kind of a thing. So death is always very close. Um, and what happens, I think, over time is that all that fear, um, it goes somewhere. There's some reservoir. You got to keep it somewhere. You lose some friends. Um, you know, you, guys, you can't really get. you're close, really close, but not too close because you know that person could be very temporary. Um, and nobody talks about that. You talk about a lot of things in the jungle, but you never talk about that. You never talk about dying. You never talk about your fear. You don't discuss any of that stuff. You just keep it inside. And I think it builds up. And like I said, you kill the things you fear. And 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 I think the hardest thing, and I'm glad at one point I almost took a ride as a door gunner because I got so disgusted with my platoon at one point, but I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't because one of the things that happens when you're a door gunner is it's a shooting gallery and you've got a 60 caliber machine gun. And those guys, they were trigger happy. Whenever we had choppers fly overhead, when I was in the jungle, I would melt in beside a tree because I knew how trigger happy those guys were. Now, I don't know if this guy intentionally killed that woman or whether he killed her and then realized she was a woman. I think he must have known something because it wasn't like, hey, I shot this person and I found out. It was that he had done it. And I think he was just trigger happy. And I think he had come to accept the fact that I'm in a chopper and I'm going to kill anybody down there. They're all the enemy. And yeah, it's hard to live with that. But I said, I could imagine that guy going home, coaching Little League, going to church and waking up with nightmares. And he didn't ask for that.
Yeah. Let's go back. When did you go into the Army and why?
It was 1969, January of 1969.
Wow. Yeah.
And I was 19 and a half and just a wild teenager. I just had tried to go to junior college. I had I had the capability to do really well in school, but I played 2 years of college football and basically never went to class. Um, I'd go to school and then start playing pinochle or do something with somebody else and just not go to class.
Obviously, you know that there's something going on in Southeast Asia and, January 69. Did that figure into your calculations at all? In your mind, when you thought, okay, well, I'm going to go into the Army, which means I'm probably going to go to Vietnam. Was that in your mind at that time?
Yes, it was because I didn't know anything about the war. Um, it was on the news, um, but in my area, nobody really protested. Nobody really, it's just we weren't in the city. It's kind of a country area. Guys worked in mills and logging and those kinds of things, and road construction. I mean, most of those kinds of people, and so we didn't really debate it. And so I didn't know, we were supposedly there helping the South Vietnamese and they were supposedly happy to have us helping them. And, that was one side of it. And the other side was that, we didn't belong there. So I didn't know. Um, I knew there was a war going on. I knew I might get pulled into the war. I wasn't actually, I kind of looked at that as something that, somebody's going to do it. Somebody's going to have to go. Um, better me than somebody else. Um, and and also the adventure of it was pulling at me. I think every boy wonders about war. What's war like? And I thought, well, it's a testing place. So you want to test yourself. And like I said, I was adventuresome. So I think probably the war was rather than repelling me, it probably attracted me.
Taking that series of flights from the US to Tanzania, do you have any recollections of those flights?
I do. I remember it. I remember it. I remember that the stewardesses were very distant. Um,
Hmm.
I remember that nobody talked. Um, I remember sleeping a lot. Um, I think we made one stop. It was either Guam or Japan, I think. And uh, and then I remember the voice on the radio telling us that we were approaching Tonsanute Air Base. I remember the plane coming down. Yeah, I remember it. Mostly I remember, mostly I remember when they opened that front doorway or front hatch, I don't know what you call it on a plane, and the light came through and then that air came through, that thick air came through. And the closer you got to that entryway, that portal, the thicker the air got. And when I stepped into it or got close to it, I couldn't breathe. The air was so thick. I just stopped breathing. I had to make myself breathe.
Yeah.
I'd never been in humidity. We were under an overhang after we got off. I was standing on the tarmac and it was so hot you could feel the heat through your soles of your shoes. And then there was an overhang and somebody with a bullhorn took us, directed us to the overhang. So we were in there and there were probably 100 of us. And of those, almost all of us were new guys. And then there was this group of about, I don't know, less than 10 guys. And they were coming home. You just knew it. I mean, they were darkly tanned. Um, they were laughing, they were talking, nothing fazed them. And so I'm here. I don't, I'm just there. I mean, just one day you're there. Don't know anything about what's going to happen next. All this weather, I can't hardly breathe. Um,
Wow.
it's just all this big, a lot of uncertainty. And then there's these guys, and they're like, they own the place. And I went over to talk to them. They didn't even want to look at me. And they did. They were polite, but it was obvious. The minute I got there, all their good happy talk stopped. They just kind of froze. And later on, I know it because I got that way. I didn't want to see somebody that had in front of them what I had just put behind me. So I understood. Even then, I understood. Um, and but it just I always thought if somebody else can do it, I can do it.
Wow.
So that's kind of how you have to look at things because the choice is gone. You're there, you put yourself there one way or the other. It's not a choice any longer. You just do it.
You said that when you went into the army, the conflict in Vietnam, you were aware of it, but it didn't really mean anything to you. You didn't have any real thoughts about it, nothing formulated. Was that still true when you arrived? Some vets say I'll ask them, what did the war mean to you? And sometimes they'll say, I really didn't think about what the war meant. I was just here, I had a job, and I was going to do my job. Did the war have any meaning to you by the time you landed in Tanzania?
Not then, but before I left, it did mean something to me. In my high school, I already had guys dying in Vietnam.
Hmm.
And, so I knew that about the war. But whether their deaths were warranted, whether they counted for something important, I didn't know. And I didn't know that until about 2 weeks later. And 2 weeks later, before I even got to my outfit, I knew because the Vietnamese people that I saw, they didn't want us there. They might be making money working for us, but there was, the gratitude that we were supposedly getting from those people, it wasn't gratitude, you know. So you have to figure that if we were really dying for those people, that they would have appreciated it. Wasn't there?
So you have 11 and a half months to go. Given your job, you can safe to assume it's not going to be an easy 11 and a half months. So then, what's what does all this become about then? If it's not about, liberating these folks and they're happy that we're here liberating them and they demonstrate it by, you know, um, responding to us, what you're getting is these folks don't want us here. So whatever we're told, why we're here, it doesn't seem to correspond with what I'm seeing. So then in your mind at that time, what what did the next 11 and a half months mean?
When when you're dropped into the jungle and people are trying to kill you, the whys don't count.
Right.
It's all about survival.
You experienced a lot of combat. Um, I wonder if you could walk us through just one fight, kind of, from and and I know sometimes these things will be very, very short and other times they'll be extended. Just pick whichever one comes to mind, if you just kind of walk through it from beginning to end.
Well, I'll take you through my first day in the jungle because at that point, I just didn't know anything. I'm going out with a bunch of guys been there a lot more than me, and I just didn't know anything. They sent me on patrol with a guy that's second tour of Vietnam E6 and some other guys. And we go way out there, and then something happens out there, and this guy tells us what we're going to do. And all this time I'm thinking, hey, I'm just going to follow orders. I don't know anything out here. When I was in training, they always said, man, you're the kind of guy that's going to get your buddies killed because you won't follow orders. Uh, and yeah, that was my personality. I would think about stuff and decide for myself. And if I had questions, I would say, I don't see how that works. Um, so anyway, so that I had all that. So then I got to Vietnam and I'm thinking, okay, this is the real deal. I'm going to listen to these guys. Anyway, we got out there. We're out there in the middle of nowhere, and this guy tells us what we're going to do because he's called back, and I'm thinking we're going to absolutely die if we do that. Um, I just, I just figured it all out. I knew the situation, I knew the setting, everything. And I asked him, I said, what's going to happen? And he said, oh, well, it'll be okay. And he said, we're going to do just what the old man told us. I guess he was talking about the company commander. I said, no, I said, you're going to do that and you're going to die here. I'm not. And I left. I left.
Mm.
I left all of them. I just got my pack on and left. And then one of the guys who came in country with me said, wait a minute, Ed, I'm going with you. So he got his stuff on and we started leaving. And then the guy calls us back and he goes, wait a minute, we're all going. And we did. And we got out of that bomb crater and probably 30 seconds or a minute later, they blew that bomb crater off the face of the earth. They dropped mortars right in it.
Wow.
And anyway, we end up back at the company and then we're at the company and they RPG the company and guys get hit. And so we spent all night, almost everybody on my side of the four foxholes, almost all those guys got wounded, maybe killed. I don't know. We never knew. Um, and then they medevaced out those guys. But anyway, I stayed there all night with my buddy Rainey. And all night they're shooting at us from the cover of the tree line. We're in a meadow. They called in flares and lit us up all night. So we're lit up all night. And they're shooting at us and we're shooting back. And Rainey and I, my buddy and I, we're shooting back and shooting M79 grenades in there, trying to keep them from massing because we're right next to the tree line. We're the four that are empty are right next to the tree line. They never manned them. So we're doing that all night. And this stupid company commander, who is a coward, the only coward I knew in Vietnam. And he was a coward because I've seen guys scared and do stuff because they're scared. I can live with that. I don't call them cowards. They just couldn't handle it at the moment. But this guy, he was scared, but he put other people at greater risk to put himself at less risk. And that's a coward. Anyway, he's screaming at us on the radio to stop doing it because we're drawing their fire because they're shooting at us and it's going over his head. He's in a big swale. He's in the safest place he could get to. Anyway, so that happened all night. And in the morning, I'm looking around thinking I've almost been killed twice. I got wounded when the RPGs hit, and I almost got killed in that bomb crater. And now they're taking me out and I'm wounded. And I'm looking at all that thinking, how efficient. And by the way, I'm looking out at night. I'm looking out, and these NVA are shooting 51 caliber bullets up at Cobra helicopters, and Cobra choppers are deadly. And a fixed wing airplane up there called Puff the Magic Dragon that can put so much firepower on the ground. It's unbelievable.
All right.
And they're shooting 51 caliber bullets up at these guys, and hellfire is just raining down on them. And then next morning, I'm thinking, these are the guys we're fighting. And these are the guys, this is the guy leading us.
Mm.
It just, I'm just thinking, how many days am I going to live out here?
I want to read a passage from your memoir. Um, and then I want to ask you a question about it. And it's a tough passage in your memoir. And what I'll say about the passage before I read it is, after almost 30 years of interviewing war vets, there aren't a whole lot of stories that stop me in my tracks. I mean, I hear them all and um, absorb them, but there aren't many, that will still kind of just, stop me in my tracks, as I said. But this is one that did. So read this, and then I have a question. And the background is, if I remember correctly, there was an NVA soldier who was badly wounded, who then put himself out of misery by putting his AK-47 in his mouth and pulling the trigger. Um, but the wound was in the back of his head, and so his face was still intact. Half of his pack was pinned beneath his back, and the rest was exposed. I could see that something had leaked out of his pack and pulled on the exposed portion of his pack, and I assumed it was the fermented fish sauce I'd heard the NVA carried to flavor their rice. I'd always wanted to know why the NVA had the distinctive smell that identified them to me, and I pulled my finger through the liquid and raised it to my nose. I'd expected it to have a pungent odor, and when it didn't, I touched my finger to my tongue. The liquid was tasteless. I was still wondering what it could be when Dennis turned the body over and my color insensitive eyes traced the trail of liquid from the hole in the back of his head to the place where it had pooled. And the question that I have, because that memory that you described there comes after, you described this NVA who was badly wounded and then who put himself out of his misery. That comes soon after another NVA you see who, if I remember correctly, his bottom half had been shredded by a claymore, I think it was. And so now these soldiers are carrying him on a stretcher, and his head is very close to you, as I think you're helping carry the stretcher, and you describe that. So in short order, we have a number of very heavy stories, each of which would, I think, bear heavily on a person's mind. I mean, just one of these, I think, would bear heavily on a person's mind for the rest of his life. You describe these three stories in rapid succession, and then there are many, many others that come with it. And so, we're getting to the theme of the war after the war. And as so I read that memory back to you, and to me, I can cobble together images in my mind, but you can actually play the tape. I imagine as I was reading those words, you played that tape. You know
Yeah.
exactly what that was. You played that tape. And the question is, and it's probably one that you probably can't answer with precision, just for the lack of, you know, language's inability to get to the heart of things often. But what is your relationship, your ongoing relationship with these memories? If the way I've even pitched that question makes sense.
I read something not very long ago that some Vietnam vet had said, and he said, he said, I only spent a year in Vietnam, but for just 1 year, it sure occupies a whole lot of space in my head.
Mm,
And I think it's that way for all of us. You know, in life, there's kind of a logical progression to your life. one thing leads to another, you carry that with you. One thing leads to another, you carry it with you. It all builds up to something. And then for us, there's Vietnam. It's this huge piece of the puzzle that never fits. It just doesn't fit. You try to make it fit, and it doesn't. It's just, we called this the world, and that was not the world. And it was us, but it wasn't us. It's just never fits. You can't make it fit. And so, but it's always trying to. I think you just have to treat it separately. But it enters my thoughts all the time. And the guys that I was with that I still in contact, there's not a day that goes by that they don't think about Vietnam. It's like being in a slow motion car wreck. Everything falls away, but what's happening at that second, and everything seems so vivid. Well, Vietnam for us was like that because it was a slow motion car wreck, and you were trying to survive it, and so the things dim, and that didn't. And for me, to this day, I can remember leaves, I can remember trails, and I've got a bad memory for a lot of things, but not for those things. And I owe things. I'm alive because other guys aren't. I made a choice. I took lives to save my own. And I didn't have anything against those guys. I had more in common with them than the guys that sent us. You got to live with those things. And then you question yourself because you're doing this thing, but you weren't a killer when you got there. But you're a killer when you came home. Or you've had to kill other people. And I don't feel that I wouldn't do it again. I would do it again. But that doesn't make it feel any better. I came home 10 years older, I think, than the person I would have been probably. And I came home with a deep appreciation for what we have here, for life here in this country, where a guy with a uniform and a gun can't take your wife or your property or your life, because we have laws that protect us and we have a vote. I deeply appreciated that. I also came home with a deeper understanding of human nature and how fear can change people. And I came home thinking I was okay. And then I look back a year later, think, well, I wasn't okay then, but I'm okay now. And then 4 years later, I look back, I wasn't okay then, I'm okay now. And finally, I think I'm at the point where I think I'm okay. But I might look back if I live long enough and say, well, I wasn't okay now. It changes you. You don't, they did a study one time on people and how they reacted to stimulus, fear stimulus. And basically, for most people, it went from one place in the brain to another place to the part that creates an action, except for two, it just went straight. Didn't go boom, boom, it just went boom. And those two were combat vets. Your brain gets rewired. Survival, our human beings are made to survive, and our brains change for survival. And so, yeah, it changes us all.